Welcome, everyone. This is Dr. Tim McGuinness. I'm the Managing Director of the Society of Citizens Against Relationship Scams, SCARS. SCARS is a government-registered crime victims assistance and crime prevention organization based in Miami, Florida. We are a former partner of the Department of Homeland Security. We're registered with the Department of Justice as a crime victims assistance provider. We provide direct services and support for scam victims, victims of cybercrime and relationship scams worldwide with our partners in over 60 countries worldwide and through our own direct support infrastructure. I want to thank everyone for joining us today on this conversation with Brett Johnson, the original internet godfather, and I'm going to let him tell a little bit of that story. I know he's probably sick to death of telling that, but I'm going to let him introduce himself. So Brett, tell me just briefly, because we want to get into a solid conversation that I've heard you tell in pieces so many other places. Okay. Tell us a little bit about who you are, what your background is. And before we begin, you're a good guy and have seen the light, and we're so grateful and appreciative for you.
Tim, I appreciate that. I'm not sure that I really appreciate you saying I'm a good guy. I don't really view myself as a good guy. I view myself as a better guy than I used to be. And why? Well, the Secret Service called me the original internet godfather. And that's a title. Yeah, it's a title. And you're right. I've told that story a lot of times. The way I got the title was 39 felonies because 38 felonies wasn't enough. So 39 felonies, I was placed on the United States Most Wanted list. They sent me to prison. I escaped from prison. All that. And the big thing, as if those things weren't big enough, the big thing is I built and ran the first organized cybercrime community. It was called Shadow Crew. It was a precursor to today's darknet and darknet markets, laid the foundation for the way modern cybercrime channels operate today. The 39 felonies, well, they had to do with refining modern financial cybercrime. So if you look at the way cybercrime operates, so that it's if you got ATOs, account takeovers, credit card theft, phishing schemes, stimulus fraud, synthetic fraud, you name the type of cybercrime that's going on online that steals money, I was the guy who helped develop a lot of it. Of course, I went to prison. Of course I did. That writing was on the wall since I was 10 years old. But the interesting thing, and it's something that I'm still coming to terms with these days, is that usually that's where the story ends. Usually you serve your time, criminal gets out. A lot of criminals, they want to do the right thing, but they go right back into crime again for various reasons. I'm very fortunate. I had my sister, I had my wife, Michelle, and then finally the FBI kind of gave me the opportunity to turn my life around. I was a lifetime criminal. And I was given this opportunity and I chose to take that path. And I lead a very blessed life these days. I really don't, I don't think I deserve the life that I have, but I'm very grateful for it. So that's why I'm able to talk to you today. And I really take it seriously about protecting people against the type of person that I used to be. And that's what I do these days, is that.
It's ironic because about 20 years ago is when I started to get more serious helping to educate victims about cybercrimes. While at the same time, I had just completed a project to reinvent the way pharmaceutical clinical trials were conducted worldwide. And actually, with a friend of mine, start a business to help and create reentry programs for federal convicts.
Right.
So have quite a bit of familiarity about what that process looks like, difficult it can be. It's extraordinarily difficult for individuals to go through the system and to come out not only sane and stable, but right, prosperous, and you're to be absolutely commended for that.
I appreciate it. And before we really get into, the cybercrime discussion, just to say a word about that. I served 7.5 years in prison. And during that time in prison, I went through several different prisons, saw and was associated with thousands of different inmates on the compound.
Even escaped from one.
Even escaped from one. And what I saw is we have this, most society has this perception that felons or convicts are these sociopaths, that they don't care. That's really not true. Most criminals are not sociopaths. During all my time in prison, 7.5 years, I met maybe 2 real, true sociopaths. Most guys that are in there, they've made a bad life choices, usually a string of them.
Yep.
And they're in prison. They're just wanting to do their time, get out and do the right thing. So they really have hope when they're released that they're going to be able to live a legal life. The problem is, and you know this with these reentry programs, the problem is you're released from prison with the exact same tools with which you enter. And unless you have help from someone, unless someone actually reaches out and helps you, if you need that support group, you need people giving you that helping hand, which, let's be honest, you don't owe a criminal anything, nothing. And a criminal can never repay you. The people that helped me, there's no way on this planet that I could ever repay what they did for me. But it's that idea of helping somebody. It takes that to really turn your life around. And without that, I'm convinced that I would be back in prison right now. Convinced of it.
Indeed. And I have no answers ultimately for what needs to be done to improve the situation. I do think that, just on that topic for a moment, I do think that society does need to understand the difference between violence and nonviolent crimes. Now, on that topic, in a sense, I actually view cybercrimes as violence.
Sure.
I don't view them as victimless, purely financial crimes. They are an act of violence. And the reason that I say that is, when we care for victims, which our organization does, we've had a little under 12,000 individuals go through our support group programs, and we've supported over the last 6 years a little over 7 million scam victims through our publications and educational materials, and provided them with information so that they can recover from this process. What we find is that they are profoundly traumatized. Their lives have changed forever, almost exactly the same as a victim of violence. So I tend to view, and this is no aspersion on you, but I tend to view crimes that have a significant and tangible impact, a traumatic impact on a victim, as being crimes of violence.
I can understand that.
And
I can. And you said, no, not to direct it at me, but let's be fair. I did that stuff for years.
Right.
I hurt and harmed people, and the damage that I did was more than just online. All right. It's not just online. People tend to think, and when I was a criminal, I thought the same thing. I live in the online world where I'm a really bad guy. And in the quote unquote, the real world, I'm a good guy. No, I was never a good guy. And the damage that I did was never just online. You help victims of romance scams. There's nothing worse than someone who is looking for companionship, friendship, or romance, that they think they have it, they put their entire heart, their being into it, they open up to this individual, only to find out at the end of the day that this individual was not only lying the entire time, but manipulating them into giving them their life savings, losing their house, losing every single thing they've got. Yeah, that's traumatic, and that's more than just an online crime. I agree completely with you on that.
It's interesting from a societal point of view. We have a similar parallel in drunk driving and societal's perception of drunk driving. So the organization MAD, who we look up to greatly, both as a model for the development of our own organization and the struggles that they went through over their almost 30-year history, as a parallel to our own. And still to this day, there is this tendency for people to look at con artists as likable, sympathetic characters. Just think of the movie Dirty Rotten Scoundrels with Steve Martin. It's a funny movie. They're con men and they're taking people for their life savings, but it's a funny movie.
Right.
It's not a funny circumstance. And yet we treat it that way. but and quite honestly, you're a very likable, personable person, which helps support you. So you found a way of capitalizing, for lack of a better term, on your strengths and your assets in positive, productive ways. And that is to be applauded. But society as a whole needs to change its perspective and view these crimes for the violence that they are. Because recently we saw an example where there was the first recorded murder by ransomware. And cyber crimes will increasingly become profoundly dangerous. The hack of the Colonial Pipeline could have had disastrous results, as we saw not so many years ago in the Southeast, where there was it wasn't a mechanical problem. It was a command and control problem that led to the explosion of a pipeline that devastated an entire suburban neighborhood, where the entire neighborhood blew up. So playing with infrastructure, more serious directed cyber crimes in infrastructure, can be catastrophic. And I understand this current administration's total and complete focus on infrastructure. Sadly, this administration gave up their focus on individual victims. We had made great progress under the previous administration. I had the pleasure of meeting with the president, the previous president, both prior to his election and after his election, to explore these issues. And 3 laws, 4 major executive orders, significant focus by the Department of Homeland Security, all of which have essentially been either de-accentuated, defocused, or just overturned and pulled away. But really what I wanted to get into was not politics. What I wanted to get was to really tap into, because I sat in on a presentation, a webinar that you participated in recently with one of our partners, about-fraud.com, the About Fraud group and one of their other partners. And I think it was more of a commercial for the partner who offers services than really a deeper delving into the complexities of cybercrime as it actually functions. And I really wanted to go into that deeply. And unfortunately, they weren't doing Q&As to speak about, but
right.
You know, there is this continuing perception, and partly this is based upon this unique phenomenon that we find ourselves in, and it exists in many other topical areas, but uniquely in cybercrimes, particularly scams, that victims have this tendency to believe that because they were a victim, they're now an instant expert in cybercrime, criminology, victimology, victimization, and they have no clue.
Right.
Our organization is very trauma informed. Our team carries certifications and extensive training in understanding and the application of modern trauma in the support that we provide to victims. Additionally, I myself am a 30-year veteran in educating about cybercrime since 1991, back in the old AOL and CompuServe days. So there is this perception, these urban legends, these falsehoods, this misinformation that continues to be spread. And while I'm not necessarily faulting individuals for wanting to participate, the problem is victims are not experts in the crimes that they suffered from. Cybercrime has grown incredibly complex over the last few years. It's not a bunch of Ghanaian citizens sitting around on a floor, 20 guys with bunk beds and some of the old photos that we saw from the early 2000s. These are very sophisticated cyber criminals that operate in corporate structures. We know of groups around the world in Kuala Lumpur, in China, in Nigeria, and elsewhere, where they work in office buildings. Some of them are converted call centers. Some of them are active call centers, where on the one hand, they're doing medical transcriptions, And in another part of the same floor, they're doing romance in Macau and investment scams and the like. Myself and another one of our SCARS directors, Debbie Montgomery Johnson, who you know, were fortunate enough to assist the National Geographic in their reporting on this topic a while back. In fact, that episode is supposed to air, I believe, within the next 30 days. But one of the things that is very self-evident is the sophistication of these criminals. They went, for example, down to Jamaica to delve into the world of lotto scams, only to find that a significant portion of the country is dedicated to scamming. It's
right.
In fact, it may be the second largest industry in Jamaica. And that's the real challenge for governments around the world is it's a multi-trillion-dollar a year industry. It brings in hard currencies to third world countries, and it's difficult to turn off that spigot. But I'm going to shut up at this point in time, and I want to hear your view. So maybe talk a little bit about the evolution of cybercrime in various forms. And few victims really understand the world of the more pure financial sides of this, from financial account takeovers to the world of credit card fraud and other forms of financial fraud, which do victimize individuals, all the way up to in cybercrime as a service.
Right. So let's go back to a moment where you were talking about how friendly and how personable I am. I am. All right. What a lot of people don't know is that I'm extremely introverted as well. All right. So I fight being introverted by being overly extroverted. Mm-hmm. Now, that's important because I'm not the only criminal that's like that. All right. For crime to succeed, three things have to take place. You have to gather the data, which means you're stealing PII or buying stolen PII, bank account numbers, credit card numbers. It's also the tools that you're using. It's those spoofed phone calls, proxy addresses, anything else that you might need to go to the next step, which is committing the crime. All right. So
can you pull your mic a little closer to you?
Sure. Let me turn it up a little bit here. Just a second. Okay. Is that better?
Yeah, because you fade out when you lean back.
Okay, so you gather data, the data that you gathered, which is a crime. You use that to commit whatever crime you're actually going to commit. See, from a criminal perspective, that's just the gathering the data aspect.
Right.
You know, you're stealing someone's PII. That's not a person. That's just data. That's the only thing that is. Then
PII,
you use that
personally identifiable information.
Right. Socials, dates of birth, whatever fool's profile, FULLZ. So if I'm creating a fool's or buying a fool's, so I can buy someone's complete identity profile online, ready-made for me, for anywhere from $30 to about $130, depending on the credit score of the victim, the gender, and the location of the victim. Okay. Mm-hmm. When I say a fool's, what I mean is for that $30, I get your name, your social, your date of birth, address, mother's maiden, driver's license number, date of birth, credit report, background check, any social media lookups that might be of interest. I get all of that for anywhere from $30 to $130.
Right.
Now, that's just the gathering the data aspect. Then I commit the crime with that. So HELOC, student loan fraud, new account fraud, credit card fraud, whatever I want to do with that. Finally, the third and most important aspect is putting cash in pocket. I need to be able to convert that crime to literal cash in pocket. So if you look at a business email compromise where I'm basically defrauding a payroll system on a corporation, getting them to send a payment instead of where they usually send it to a bank, instead to a bank account that I control, I can easily commit BEC, business email compromise. I can easily do that. I can easily talk a company into sending me $3 or $4 million into a bank account that I control. Does that mean that I've profited $3 or $4 million? No, it doesn't. I have to be able to get that cash out of the account, get it into my pocket. That becomes extremely difficult a lot of the time. That tends to be the funnel with a lot of these crimes, is the laundering mechanism. How do I convert that crime into cash? Now, the reason I say that, and if you remember, I was talking about being personable. For me to defraud a victim, That's an individual or an organization. For me to do that, I have to get that potential victim to trust me. So how do I do that? How do I get an individual to trust me? How do I get a corporation to trust me? Well, I would argue that it's a combination of technology, tools, and social engineering. So we inherently trust the technology which is given to us. We trust our cell phones, we trust our laptops, we trust the websites we go to. We trust Amazon to ship us those items. We trust eBay not to send us some sort of counterfeit good. It's interesting when you think about it, but we trust Amazon, even though 80% of all the reviews on Amazon are fake. We still trust them. Now, I know 80% of those reviews are fake. I still read the reviews in order to know which sellers to go to. So it's weird. There's this weird relationship where we trust the technology, even though a part of us realizes that, there's some stuff wrong with that. That's the problem with fake news. We trust the news that comes across the line without ever really verifying it. What we don't understand is that criminals use a variety of tools to manipulate that technology. They use a spoof phone number. So it's very easy to, instead of seeing the phone number that I'm calling from, I can make it look like your financial organization, the IRS, the SSA, some group like that. I can use a proxy address so that instead of it showing that my physical location is in Ghana, Nigeria, the UK, Florida, I can make it look like I'm in New York, South America, wherever I want it to look like. So I use technology is there. I use the tools to manipulate the technology. That lays a base level of trust. That's the only thing it does. You mentioned personable and friendly. Now, here's where this really kicks in. At that point, once that base level is established, you see the phone number coming across of the Social Security Administration. That's a base level of trust. If I were to call in, you pick up the phone, you see that on the caller ID that it's the SSA, and you immediately hear some guy on the other end saying, hey, yes, this is Vladimir, and I'm looking, you have warrant for your arrest on Social Security number. I need you to go down and get $30,000 worth of gift cards. Probably, hopefully, you don't believe that. Why? Even though the number says I'm calling from the Social Security Administration, why don't you believe it? Because I've not built enough trust with you yet.
Right.
So technology and tools lays a base level of trust, and then social engineering kicks in. We get to see how good of a liar, how good of a con man, how good of a social engineer that criminal is in order to manipulate you into information access, data, or cash. So that personable, friendly stuff that you talked about, that's really important. The media portrays, like you said, Steve Martin as this rotten, dirty, rotten scoundrel. Real fun to watch. I mean, it's a great film. It's a great film. And most of these con movies, you've got The Sting, you've got all these other movies that are out there where we really like the bad guy. And there's an essence of truth there. There's this little nugget of truth that, hey, we are personable. We are extremely engaging. We are friendly. But we use that. We're constantly manipulating, constantly. I am constantly reading the crowd. All right. To this day, I'm one of the best social engineers around. And I am constantly reading people. Bam, 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 bam. I know what these people are thinking. I know what it takes to manipulate these people, everything else. To this day, I do that. Back then, the difference is I used that to harm people, because if you can gauge what really motivates an individual, you can talk that individual into doing whatever you want them to do. And that's the way these scams tend to operate. So yeah, we're extremely engaging. We're very friendly and everything else. The interesting thing that you mentioned to me is the sophistication of the criminal. I would take exception to that. I would say they're very good social engineers, but they're not very sophisticated when it comes to computer crimes. But they don't have to be. All right. So if you think about it, the statistic right now is that 90% of every single attack uses a known exploit. So zero-day attacks really don't matter. What matters is that we've been told about doing this stuff for years, either as individuals or companies. They've been preached at, people have been preached at for years. You need to do this, you need to do this, you need to do this. But they've not. And so that 90% today, 90% of every single attack uses a known exploit. For example, I talk to people all the time when I give a presentation to consumers. The first thing out of the gate, freeze your credit. Freeze the credit. It stops all new account fraud. Credit freezes have been free since 2018. Today, the percent of the population that has a credit freeze in place, 12%. It's been free for 3 years, only 12% of the population. Now, it stops all new account fraud. but we've still only got 12% of everybody in the United States that have a credit freeze in place. That's a problem. Same thing with passwords. I know that 80% of every single person uses the same password and log in across multiple websites. I know that. So if I know this kind of stuff, does that mean I'm a sophisticated criminal? No. That just simply means you're not doing what you need to do. The platform, the cybercrime platform is where the sophistication is. So if you look at unemployment fraud, there were 16-year-olds on Telegram stealing $60,000 a week, committing unemployment fraud. Now that 16-year-old is not a computer genius. He's not. He's not. That's plug and play at that point. Any 16-year-old could have done that if they were willing to engage in that type of crime. All right. The sophistication comes in a couple of different points. First of all, the states had no security in place whatsoever. None. The CARES Act had actually taken away the security that was in place. So there was no security in place with the states, with PPP fraud, anything else like that. At the same time, the data was readily available. So you can go to robocheck.cm. It's a criminal website. It lists the social security numbers and dates of birth of 170 million Americans. Pre-pandemic, those things sold for $2.90 a piece. Because of the pandemic, those things sell today for $6.70 a piece. So that's the problem with this thing is the platform is there. A criminal doesn't have to know how to do anything. He can simply get it done for him. For example, there's a site called Second Eye Solution. If you're needing a fake driver's license. So today, if you're setting up a bank account, if you're taking over an account, if you're trying to verify an account, oftentimes they'll want you to send a scan of your driver's license. So this site does that for you. For $30, they'll make a scan of your driver's license. They'll put some other guy's picture on it for you. If they want you to take a selfie with it, if you're trying to verify through a bank and the bank wants a selfie with the ID for $50, this guy will take the selfie ID with you. It goes a little bit further than that. If you're trying to bypass one specific type of system, what Second Eye Solution does, you go to a screen and it says, what are you trying to verify? Are you trying to verify Coinbase or PayPal, or what system are you trying to get past? You click the box and they design the product to get past that system. So now you've got a criminal that doesn't have to know how to create a fake ID, doesn't have to know any type of security that's on the system or how to bypass the system. It's done for them all the time. So the criminals themselves are not really sophisticated. You do have some of those attackers out there like that, but 99%, nah, they're just really good social engineers. That's what they are. That's the sophistication is in the platform, not the individual. And I don't know if that answered the question, but
partly, I would argue that maybe the percentage is even less, because the reality is when we're talking about the West Africans, for example, they're liars to be sure, but they're not particularly good at it, but they depend upon a less informed, more vulnerable audience. You know, we talked about, or you talked about, stranger trust. It's a bona fide bias, cognitive bias, that exists within all humans. We evolved to trust our fellow tribal members. And when we consider ourselves part of a tribe from an anthropological point of view, we automatically offer our trust, unless we have visual, auditory, other sense clues that indicate that danger is present. Then we will withdraw it. But you can walk up to any person on the street, and 7 out of 10 times you can ask them for the password and they will tell you. We just demonstrate. So can you talk a little bit about the mechanics of the outsourcing side? In other words, cybercrime as a service, and how that's functioning today?
Sure. So again, let's go back to those 3 necessities of cybercrime: gathering data, committing crime, cashing out. Now, a single criminal cannot do all 3 things. He can do one thing, sometimes he can do 2. All 3, not going to happen. Simply not going to happen. And there's 2 reasons for that. The first reason is a skill gap. That specific criminal simply can't do one of those legs, one of those 3 things, all right? So he can't gather data. Maybe he doesn't know how to do a phishing scheme. Maybe he can't launch a man-in-the-middle attack, or whatever that is that's gathering that type of data, or that's building that specific tool. He doesn't know how to manually spoof phone numbers, or how to take over a router and set up a proxy address. So he has to rely on somebody else to do that service, that cybercrime service you just mentioned. That's that leg there, but it's also in the commission of the crimes. So nowadays, retailers and merchants are being hit ad nauseum with this thing called refund fraud. Right. And basically the way it works is you order a MacBook Pro or a laptop or what have you, and you get it in, and a crime then happens where you get to keep the MacBook and you get your money back. Well, if you don't know how to do that specific crime, guess what? You can pay some guy 7 to 15% of whatever the order total is to do it for you. So that's that other leg. That's that platform that's there. That platform of crime facilitates all this. Cashing out's a big one, because you've got to be able to put cash in pocket at the end of the day. If you're not profiting from the crime, why commit it? A lot of people simply don't know how to set up bank accounts. They don't know how to cash out a prepaid card properly, or where to get prepaid cards, or how to do gift card fraud or anything else like that. So the first aspect of that is that skill gap. We see that there's a gap where someone can't do something, so they have to rely on somebody else to do that, some service to do that. That's this platform that we're talking about. Now, when I started with Shadow Crew, that platform was not in existence. We built that from the ground up. And the way you build that, it's this thing called trust.
Right.
You know, we as good guys, we trust our technology, we trust the websites, we trust where we're going. That's why we're online. If we didn't have that trust, believe you me, we would not be online. We trust where we're going. Criminals are the exact same way. Criminals have to trust their criminal associates. If I'm buying product or services from another group, I have to be able to trust that the product and service works, that I'm not buying it from a law enforcement agent, that everything's going to work okay. So I have to be able to trust that. Shadow Crew, the group that I started, solved that. They gave a trust mechanism for criminals to use. You have now, and it wasn't like it was rocket science back then. What we did is we launched a forum. All right. So now you had a large communication channel where people from different time zones could reference conversations days, weeks, months old. They could learn from them, take part in it. They could look at someone's screen name, determine the skill level of that person just by looking at the screen name. We had vouching systems in place. And when you vouch for someone, what that basically means is I accept responsibility for who I say is good here.
Sort of a dark web version of social media.
That's exactly what that is. That's exactly what that is. It's a take on the old mafia. I vouch for this guy. Well, when you vouch for somebody, if he rips somebody off, I'm not going to go to him. I'm going to go to you because you said he was good. You're responsible for his actions. And you take that seriously in a criminal world. So we had those vouching systems. We had review systems in place to the degree that it became almost a real-time data construct. So that if you were buying credit card information from one seller, the reviews were coming in. Everyone knew how good that seller was at that specific time. If the seller got a bad batch of credit cards in, bad reviews almost instantaneously started popping up. So everyone knew immediately, hey, that batch is bad. Let's go to this other seller right now that's good. All right. So you had review systems, you had escrow systems in place so that if the new seller comes up, no one trusts that person yet. Well, guess what? You trust the website that you're on, this dark web marketplace. We will hold your money for you until you get your product or service, make sure it works. And then at that point, that money is released to the criminal that sold it to you. All that was put together so that criminals could trust each other. All right. So, but again, it goes past that. It's this idea that a criminal has to establish trust with that potential victim. So I've already talked about how it's done with individuals. How do you do that with an organization? Well, you can do it with stolen credentials. You can do it with spoofed calls, spoofed browser fingerprints, any number of things in order to gain entry into the system and get that system to trust you. It all boils down to trust at the end of the day. What you see more often than not.
If I can interrupt you for a second, a good example of that is what happened this last week with the FBI. Someone breached their email servers, took control of their email servers, created new email accounts ad nauseum, then sold those email addresses on the dark web to other criminals who then exploited them for malware, ransomware, phishing scams. Unfortunately, the FBI isn't fully admitting how long this went on for. There are some theories that it may actually have gone on for months.
And it may have
happened only for one day.
Right, and no one knows the time yet. We've not gotten that full information yet. The issue with that, if you have an FBI.gov address, what can you do at that point? Well, you can do whatever you want to do at that point. You can get a company to give you whatever type of information that you're looking for. You can gain entry to a company's website, anything else like that. It's extremely, that's that credential. That's that, how much trust does that bring with it? It brings a lot of trust with it, a lot of trust. So that's the issue that we're facing these days. And that's not, if you look at Robinhood, if you look at the FBI, stuff like that, probably those attacks used known exploits. It was somebody that, hey, it was wide open. We just scanned the system, maybe an open SMBs there, what have you, and we gained entry like that. If you look at ransomware, you mentioned ransomware earlier. Pre-pandemic, ransomware deployment was usually some sort of social engineering technique. You'd send out an email, hope someone clicks on the PDF, whatever you. You'd drop a thumb drive in a parking lot, which someone at that point would always pick it up and plug it in. So some sort of social engineering technique. Post-pandemic, it changes. Now 51% of all ransomware deployments is through brute forcing an open SMB. Or it's through brute forcing SMB ports is what that is, all right? That's 51%. Why is that? Well, we've got all these people working remote now. That's the issue. And I know as a criminal that the statistic is 41% of every single router has the default password. So if I know that, what's the chances that I can brute force that password to an SMB port? Probably pretty good. Probably.
Not just business routers, but home routers as well.
Home routers as well. And that's just for routers. That doesn't even mention IoT devices. How easy is it for me to get the default password? It's a Google search. That's all it is. So that's these issues. I mean, we're told to do these things. We don't do it because we don't view it as serious enough, or we'll do it later.
Right.
And that becomes the issue all of a sudden.
Well, you know, I equate it to automobiles. In the early days of automobiles, you had to be a very specialized individual to even contemplate owning a car. And you had to be mechanically inclined because they broke down all the time. But after the war, cars became easy. They became reliable. And the result is that you now had to have driver's licenses because unskilled individuals were killing people with rapid frequency. But another phenomenon happened is we became a culture of overconfidence when it came to cars. And you see this every day with parents' treatment of their children. They're either completely freaked out, justifiably, or they put an adolescent behind the most deadly weapon that the average person will own, with severe consequences. But just look at our attitude towards cars. The average person will exceed the recommended brake life by double.
Right.
They won't check their engines, their fluids, whatever. It's estimated that fully half of the vehicles on the road are technically unsafe, but their owners operate in this delusional state.
Right.
I don't mean mental illness, but just a cognitive distortion, confirmation bias. They believe what they want to believe, that they're safe and fine and all of this is great. Yet 45,000 people die a year because of automobile accidents.
And you know, we're talking about what people should be doing.
Right.
I want to make sure that the people who are listening out there know that the only person that's responsible for crime is the criminal. Yes,
No
and I'm adamant about this. I'm adamant about that. I mean, I don't care if it's online. I don't care if it's in the physical world. If someone leaves their front door open, wide open in the neighborhood, and they go to the store for 3 or 4 hours and they come back and their house is burglarized, the only person responsible for that is the criminal. It's an active choice on a criminal's part to victimize you. All right. So that being said, criminals tend to hit the lowest hanging fruit. If you are that individual that has not done what you need to do, you are one of those lowest pieces of lowest hanging fruit that's out there. And it's not really complicated to protect yourself. It's really not. If you think about the way a scam works, scams work because a criminal is trying to get you to think emotionally, to react emotionally to whatever's going on in that situation. That's one of these things with with why romance scams are so insidious, and they truly are. You mentioned that thing, you mentioned it a minute ago, part of a tribe. So a scammer starts on a romance site. He's got that potential victim over here. He's not part of that tribe at that point in time. But because they communicate for such a length of time, it's all about making sure that that victim is part of the tribe of the scammer.
Right.
And when that happens, and when it finally comes to fruition and the victim realizes that they've been victimized, at that point, that's why it causes so much harm. Because you're that scammer is now part of your tribe, part of your family. You've shared every single thing with that person that's ripping you off, that
Right.
really doesn't care about you. You think that person has cared about you for, I don't know, potentially years sometimes. I talked to a guy, his mom, Social Security, that's the only money she had coming in. I did a podcast about it. The only money she had coming in was her Social Security money. She gives all of her money to this scammer. To this day, she argues that he wasn't a scammer. She loses her house to this scammer, loses her house to this guy. The
Right.
son at one point takes over the money for the mom because she's sending every penny she's got to this guy. The house before she loses the house, it has to have some repairs. $30,000 worth of repairs. The poor son, he's foolish enough to give the money to the mom. He trusts the mom enough, thinking that she'll pay the contractors. No, that $30K went right over to the scammer. It's this idea that, we as human beings, we want companionship. We don't want to die alone. We want to make sure we've got friends. We need that human interaction. And
Yes.
when that's taken advantage of, man, that causes some pain. That causes a lot of trauma. So I agree with you, what you said at the beginning of our talk of, it's a violent crime. It is a violent crime, especially that you're putting everything you've got, you're trusting this person with your life, and they take advantage of that. There's nothing worse than that. I mean, there's a lot of things worse than that, but that's really up there as far as causing pain and trauma and everything else. It truly is.
Indeed.
And you've talked to a lot of victims. I have too. And one of the interesting things that I talk about is a lot of victims, they think while the scam's going on, it could be a scam. I'm sure the only thing this person is wanting is money, and yet they still send the money out.
Well,
so why is that?
There's two things that are really interesting about that. One is, after the scam is when victims always say, yes, I knew it was a scam, but I did it anyway. Except that's not really true. There's this bias called hindsight bias, which is very interesting. The human mind tries to make order out of chaos. We try to make sense of the world that we live in. And after the fact, when something terrible happens to us, we come to the realization that we are vulnerable, that we are powerless. And unfortunately, our own psychology pulls away from that rather than embracing it. Because if you're powerless and vulnerable, the simple solution is you learn not to be. It actually isn't complicated. But what the mind does is, this is why victims are such unreliable witnesses, is the mind fills in gaps. It invents memories. It looks back at things that were red flags that you didn't know at the time, and it says, I must have known that. How could I be that stupid?
Right.
When in reality, they didn't at that time. And this also creates a really interesting logical conflict that is the basis of a lot of shame and guilt. Because consider this. If a victim truly didn't know and they were vulnerable and powerless, there is no blame. It wasn't their fault.
Right.
Made a mistake to talk to a stranger. That's it. Yet, on the other hand, afterwards, that's a very unacceptable proposition for someone psychologically. So the result is they believe, I saw the red flags, I just didn't act on them. Now, the problem then is, if you were aware and didn't act, you are in fact guilty of not acting. This then happens inside the brain, and it is a basis for a lot of shame. I knew, but I didn't do anything about it, therefore I am guilty. I let this happen. So on the one hand, it helps us maintain and build our self-confidence after an extraordinary moment of powerlessness and vulnerability. On the other hand, long-term, it creates a conflict in our mind that we can't reconcile. How could I allow this to happen? These are the exact words that victims say.
But you know what's you're saying this, and I'm realizing too, but it also, when the victim blames themselves in that situation like that,
Right.
it also gives them control of that situation. I'm at fault. I allowed this
Exactly.
to happen.
But it also prevents them from forgiving themselves and moving forward into recovery, because they carry that shame and guilt with them, because they believe in, not perhaps consciously, but subconsciously, the subtext of their descriptions about themselves define themselves as being culpable, not just responsible, but culpable. And part of our recovery process is helping victims understand that part of what you remember after the fact are invented memories.
Right.
And that traumatic memories of what really happened is actually suppressed by the trauma that you experience as well. So the complexity of the psychology of a victim is significantly more complicated than most people will allow themselves to believe. Particularly, a full third of victims cannot reconcile the fact that they were emotionally harmed by a scam, but they're profoundly angry. A typical response, a fight response from trauma. So the psychological underpinnings from a victimology point of view create a more complex situation than most people are aware of. This is why we characterize this as violence, because it's very similar to someone who has been physically assaulted, domestic abuse, sexual assault, etc. The same kinds of trauma evidence themselves in the same kind of responses. And there are, sadly, victims who have been years since their scam ended, but are still in a state of freeze, in a state of collapse, in effect, who cannot move forward.
Right.
This isn't denial. This is simply a trauma response. But one of the things I wanted to ask you about is there's been a sea change in the world of relationship scams in the last year and a half because of the pandemic. And it is with the explosion of what's called pig butchering scams, a horrific description of a fairly simple technique. One of the challenges of the traditional relationship scammer, or in fact, most types of interactive fraud, is the necessity to spin a story that necessitates some form of a money transaction.
Right.
And when we're talking about romance and regular relationship scams, it's a complicated story. My dog ate my papers and I'm now arrested in a jail in Mozambique, right? I'm an oil worker and I lost my papers so I can't get off the rig, whatever nonsense story it happens to be. But that's complicated and it requires a more complex level of trust by the victim. Now, this new Chinese model that is spreading the world over, the pig butcher or pig slaughter or whatever they want to call it, is you engage in a romance. There's no subterfuge in the romance part of it per se. There's no emergency story. There's no necessity. But then they introduce an investment opportunity.
Okay.
And then the scammer presents the investment opportunity, usually in Bitcoin, or might be even a fake IPO, and they have a fully realized fake website or fake app, and it's technologically well developed. Person invests their money. Many times, they're clever enough that they get the person to invest a small amount of money, but it shows in their account on the app or the website, and then it shows gains that they've realized. Their money is doubled or tripled or whatever. And okay, now is the time to come in hot and heavy and invest a big amount. And of course, when they do that, the scammer fades away, the website goes down, the app stops working, they can't communicate with anybody. In your involvement with the FBI and others, to what extent have you been aware of this new transformation of China being an exporter of cybercrime to the extent that it is now today?
I mean, China's been doing cybercrime for years. You know that.
Right.
It's historically been IPs, intellectual property that's been stolen. It's not surprising that since you had China involved in online crime, it's not surprising that as it becomes more prolific, people start to understand the way online environments operate, that you would have these types of scams come to fruition either. That investment scam, if you think about it, it then goes back to trust again. So people are used to the romance scams where you introduce the idea, like you said, not being able to get off the oil rig, or my son needs an operation, or what. They're used to those stories. We're used to that. The interesting thing these days is that, as you know, cryptocurrency is going through the roof. Stock market's going through the roof. So people have that idea of these gains, of these massive gains when you invest in, and I don't say invest, I say when you play the lottery of cryptocurrency. They have this thing where they understand that. It's not difficult to feed into that. You know, you have that romance. You don't mention anything about a scam, nothing else, you know, and you show the car that you're driving, or, you know, pictures of your house or whatever. And this is where I live. And why do you make your money? Well, I do crypto. You just leave it out there. You know, I do crypto, and I invest in a lot of stuff. And a few months later, you come up and say, well, you know, hey, you see the money I'm making. If you're wanting to get into this, there's a great opportunity coming up. Don't really care if you do it or not.
Typical long con.
Long con, because the longer you go, and it's what criminals understand these days. It's almost a mass perception that's hit. It started to hit a little bit before the pandemic, but now it's really taken hold. This idea of patience. The longer you're in a system, or the longer you're talking to that potential victim, the more you establish trust. All right, the more legitimate you appear, until you get to the point where you offer this opportunity. You know, I don't really care if you take it or not. I'm going to get into it because I know what the gains are, and you see how much money I've been making. Mm-hmm. You know, if you want to, just, hey, put a couple $100 into it, see what it makes you. So if they send you the 200, the gains, even if you have to pay, the weird thing is $200 turns into $1,000. Okay, if I need to. If you really want that $1,000, well, I'm not just scamming you. I've got a whole slew of people that I'm running the same con on. So yeah, I'll give you that $1,000 because I know I'm going to get that back, because all of a sudden, hey, you get your gains. I've got this opportunity. You don't want to miss out on this. How much money can you give us? How much money can you put in? 1,000's all you've got. That's really all you've got. We're talking about you being able to retire on this one opportunity right here. You know, that's that old boiler room stuff with the phone calls. Smile and dial, spray and pray, whatever you want to call it. It's just you're putting those two aspects together. You're building trust with that romance victim through that long con. Everything looks legitimate. I love you, I love you, I love you, blah, 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 blah. So you gain the trust, and then you offer the opportunity. Do people take it? Sure, they take it. Sure, they do. But it's still, it causes that same amount of harm that you thought. I mean, they were making all kinds of money. You know, I read every day, or see on the internet every day, about how much Bitcoin's increasing and everything else. And this new coin came out. Yeah. And it's not like, I mean, so if you're talking about crypto, there's a company today, there's several companies that you can pay $200 and they will create a coin for you.
Right.
That's the thing. So you can say, hey, here's your coin. Doesn't mean anything. Doesn't mean anything at all. Yeah, you've got the coin.
It's like the stock market in the 1920s.
That's it. That's it. And I think we're going to see a big crash. I mean, we have to. People can't continue to make those kinds of gains without a crash coming. You know, and we see, especially in the crypto world right now, you see scam upon scam upon scam, because it's not regulated or anything else. Anyone can create a coin. They can hype it up big enough and then get enough investors and then do what's called a rug pull. They just pull all the liquidity out and it's done at that point. And that's what a lot of these scams consist of, is exactly that.
Before we end the call, and I don't want to, I would love to continue talking to you for hours, but I don't want to abuse the opportunity that we have today, and want to try and hold it to an hour.
Sure.
One of the things that we saw during the pandemic was an explosion of scams and cybercrime across the board. Some estimates, cybersecurity industry estimates, are that there were 30 million scam victims in the United States in 2020 alone, up 2,000% from the previous year. We understand the dynamics of that. What do you hear from your connections in industry and the world of law enforcement, et cetera, on what the real magnitudes of money being generated by cybercrime are today? McAfee said a couple of years back that we could expect to see $6 trillion generated by cybercrime by the end of 2021. But that was said in 2018.
Right. So think about it like this, all right? The pandemic hits, the government basically gives away money. There was no security in place. So you really had that influx. To give you an idea how these numbers grow, when the feds shut down Shadow Crew, we ended with 4,000 members. Fast forward to 2017, Alphabet shut down by law enforcement, 240,000 members. Fast forward 2 more years to 2019, black markets shut down, 1.15 million members. That's pre-pandemic. The pandemic hits and you had 16-year-olds stealing $60,000 a week, and they were not unique in that. Right. You had states, Arizona admits to $4 billion. The number is more like $30 billion that was lost to unemployment
for one state.
One state. California admits to $21 billion. They admit to that. The number is much higher, probably 4 times that amount. So you had these numbers being stolen by people who they didn't have to know how to commit a crime. They could buy a tutorial for $10 that walked them through the questions and what they needed to do to get that money. So did those numbers increase or decrease? Oh, they exploded. They exploded. Not only did they explode, but they told those new fraudsters and the old fraudsters, hey, there's a lot of profit to be made. A lot. Yeah, they may shut down the stimulus, but guess what? We need to start looking at these areas what we've not looked at before. Where can we profit? That's why you've got ransomware attacks on Colonial Pipeline. That's why you've got the Kaseya, the supply chain attacks that are happening, everything else. The verticals that were never really hit before, criminals are looking at that and they're profiting by it. The biggest lie in the world is that crime doesn't pay. Yes, it pays. If it didn't, you wouldn't have all these criminals out there. So it's important to protect yourself from that and to realize that, hey, yeah, I like being online too. I like going out to the store and everything else, but there are predators in our lives and we have to be vigilant. We have to be conscious. We have to have that situational awareness, both online and in the real world. If we don't, we're going to be victimized. So it's just important to realize that.
How do we get government to make the necessary changes, or is it even possible at this point in time?
It's not going to happen. It's not going to happen. Name me a president who has assigned proper attribution to the crimes. We've got an administration right now that the guys intel communities have said, hey, Russia sanctions these attacks. And what's been the response? I don't believe that. I don't believe that at all. If you can't even do that, how are you going to come in and have proper regulation? You're not. You're not. And then we're in a society, and Lord knows I love capitalism. I do. I love it. But if you have security that's based on profit, that becomes a problem all of a sudden. You have to have regulation. And then you add in an administration that says, hey, not going to get it from us. That's an issue. That's a huge issue, because at the end of the day, it's like Hillary Clinton's book, It Takes a Village. It does. We have to look after each other. Verticals have to look after each other. The siloed approach to security doesn't work anymore. We have to look after each other. We have these romance victims or these telephone scam victims that they walk into Sephora and they buy $30,000 worth of gift cards. There's a whole lot wrong with that. Yes, certainly the victim shouldn't have walked in there and bought $30K in gift cards. But the cashier that sold those gift cards, they really didn't think anything was wrong? Seriously? So we have to start looking after each other. That's what it's going to take. I mean, criminals collaborate all the time. Until we start collaborating and doing the same, we're always going to be behind that curve. So that's what it's going to take.
Thank you.
Yes, sir. Thank you.
We've arrived at the end of our allotted time, and I'm so incredibly appreciative for you taking the time to talk to me today and having this conversation with us. It's been eye-opening as always. And again, thank you so much for being my guest today.
No, I love it, Tim. I love you guys. You keep up the great work you all are doing.
We appreciate that. So this has been a presentation of the Society of Citizens Against Relationship Scams. This video is copyright 2021 SCARS. To learn more about our organization, visit www.againstscams.org. To learn more about cybercrimes, scams, particularly relationship and romance scams, visit www.romancescamsnow.com. Remember, to report scams, visit anyscam.com, the FBI's IC3 website, ic3.gov, and also the FTC's website, which is reportfraud.ftc.gov. Those are the essential reporting tools. In every report matters. Even if they don't contact you after you've made your report, that information accumulates and empowers the government to perform investigations and to make arrests. Again, thank you to my guest, Brett Johnson, advisor to the FBI and the corporate America. Great job that you do, and an outstanding public speaker. And thank you so much for being with me today.
Thank you, Tim.
All right. Thank you again. Bye-bye.
All right. That was good.